Hi, I'm Katie, and this tutorial is a basic introduction to the concepts of reversible stitching as demonstrated on the Britomart sampler, which is stitched reversibly, and it's intended to give you an idea of what that encompasses and whether or not you want to undertake stitching the Britomart sampler reversibly ahead of its release. It is a truly spectacular reveal to flip your piece over to reveal a complete design on the back, but it does take more time, thought, and effort. As I got more used to reversible stitching, this was my first piece that I did stitch reversibly, and I got into the proper mindset. I actually found it a very interesting exercise. Now, I do want to mention that I'm using the word reversible in a very loose definition, and that's meaning a complete design on the back, not that front and back are identical. Very few stitches are fully reversible, which would mean that they are identical in structure, both front and back. Even reversible cross is not actually fully reversible unless it's done a CC style. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. So a few examples of that. Long arm cross, double back stitch, and Montenegrin stitch can be broadly classed as reversible because they give you a design front and back, but they're not fully reversible because their stitch structures are not identical front and back. Reversible stitching is about both theory and application. For those of you who can quickly grasp the theory, this tutorial combined with Darlene O'Steen's book, The Proper Stitch, details of which are in the description, will be enough to get you up and running on this piece or another reversible project. For detailed step-by-step application and a more detailed look at the theory, a class is offered alongside the Britomart sampler that will cover stitching it reversibly and single-sided in excruciating detail if you need more instruction on the techniques. There are a lot of variables with reversible stitching, which is one reason that this tutorial is just an introduction to reversible stitching. For example, how you start and stop your thread for it to be invisible front and back varies a great deal depending on the stitch and its application. There isn't just one way to do it that applies to all situations. Which you use depends both on the stitch and what you're doing with it. Today, we're going to look at a couple of the foundational stitches for reversible stitching and how I approach them as an introduction to both the concept and its application. The first stitch that we're going to look at that is stitched reversibly is actually double running stitch, but as part of illustrating what double running stitch can do for you, whether you're stitching reversibly or not, we're going to look at the same border motif worked in both backstitch and double running stitch. So I am demonstrating with a section of one of the borders on the Britomart sampler, which is a very simple application of double running stitch, but we're going to look at this first in backstitch so you can see why you might want to use double running stitch even if you're not stitching reversibly. Sorry, this is always a little difficult trying to stitch with the camera where your head should be, but at the moment I am just doing regular backstitch, absolutely no frills. I'm breaking off from the horizontal line of the border, and then I'm coming up to work my first motif on this border segment. Again, just regular backstitch, nothing special here. And as I close up this arm, we're going to see why it is that you might want to consider double running stitch for use, whether or not you're stitching reversibly. The big difference on reversible versus non-reversible stitching with double running stitch is how careful you are about hiding your thread startings and endings. So right now we can see that point at which my needle is going down. I'm going to pull that through, but I now need to return here to work the next arm of this element, which results in a carry, which is something that we would not have if working this in double running stitch, as we'll see when I move to demonstrating in double running stitch. How problematic the carry is really varies depending on how careful you want your back to be, how dark your thread is, and how complicated the element is. Here, this is really small. It's not a huge deal. This is just for demonstration purposes. And again, here I've got another carry coming from the side back to the center line. The real advantage of double running stitch, if you're not stitching reversibly, is that it always returns you to where you need to be. And then I'm just going to finish off the top of this border motif and backstitch. Oops, sorry, knocked the frame. That gives me one complete border element, and as you can see, I'm going down here, and I need to carry back to the next place I'm going to stitch, which is this bottom line, which gives me another carry. These are, like I said, not a big deal here, but they get bigger and more problematic with the larger and more complex border elements in particular, although there are a lot of places on the Britomart sampler where you can benefit from using double running stitch versus backstitch. It just allows you to move much more efficiently and effectively through your motifs and your stitching. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause this. I'm going to work the rest of this stretch in backstitch off camera, and then we'll return to it to take a look at the back and how that contrasts with the same segment but worked in double running stitch. So I have now finished my backstitch example, which we can see here, and then I am going to insert a photo of what that looks like on the back, because that's really where the difference between these two stitches lie. I'm working them next to each other so that you can see that they are actually identical on the front, and that the back structure and the ease of working through it with double running stitch is why you might want to consider double running stitch for your elements, even if you're not stitching reversibly. If you are stitching reversibly, you really don't have much of a choice. Double running stitch is one of the foundational stitches of reversible stitching, and it really is quite simple once you get a hang of it. So I'm going to work this same stretch again, but in double running stitch, and I am starting my thread here with a horizontal pin stitch. So I've taken a half stitch each side, pinned it, and then I'm going to go back over it with one stitch over two threads, which is a invisible way of starting my thread, although not a strictly reversible one. It is not identical front and back. You get two half stitches on the back. You get a slightly thicker stitch to start with, but it's a really quick and easy way to start if you're doing double running stitch. And so I will freely admit that I cheat sometimes. You don't have to do everything perfectly and by the book to have a good result, I think is really the lesson here. That thicker stitch is going to look much more out of place here in isolation than it does when you're looking at a complete sampler. So now we're going to talk about double running stitch. And before I begin demonstrating, I'd like to talk you through some of the points here. There are some key points to keep in mind here. First, you're only going to see half of the motif as you start filling in. Those visual gaps between your stitches can be very distracting at first because you have to mentally fill them in and be able to follow the pattern. This is something that is more difficult when you're just starting out. After a while, it becomes second nature and it will not bother you at all. So if you find it challenging at first, Don't be discouraged. Many people do. I did myself at first, and now I can do it pretty smoothly. The second really important concept is what I like to call branching, and it is what is more generally termed stitch path. And so that's deciding how to approach and order your stitches. My general rule is that I branch off and work something at the first place it intersects with my current branch, and that way I don't miss anything. There are frequently multiple possible paths with double running stitch, and so what seems most logical to you will vary with every stitcher. What we're doing in this tutorial is how I myself approach it. It's not the only correct way. So what we might call the main branch of double running stitch on this border is this horizontal bottom line. And think of it as the tree trunk, and then you have some larger branches coming out of it, which are those vertical lines, and then smaller branches coming out of those branches, which are all these small elements off that horizontal. You're always going to close up each individual branch before making your way back to the trunk. And each motif on a border like this branches off the main branch. So you're going to be looking at a finished individual border motif before you return to this horizontal line. If you're not, something has gone wrong. So you will start working from left to right, as I'm going to be doing here. And then when you reach the right side, you should be looking at a row of little motifs anchored by a row of running stitch as opposed to fully closed up black stitch, which I have on the top example here. At that point, then you would come back right to left, fill in those little gaps, close up the main branch, and then you'll have a motif that looks identical to my back stitch example on the front, although very different on the back. And before I start, I do have one general tip about reversible stitching. So I like to run my fingers over the back of the work just like this, but on the back while I'm stitching, and that allows me to feel any knots, loops, or errors that have developed without having to turn the frame over and look constantly. When I first started the Britomart sampler, I was new to reversible stitching and constantly flipping the frame over to check the back. As I got more comfortable, I found that I could just feel that with my fingertips instead and would just turn it over occasionally for a visual check. As I was more effectively thinking my way through the motifs, I found that I could adequately picture where the thread was passing on the back. And so I just needed that little tactile check to make sure that nothing had knotted or gone wrong. So let's talk double running stitch. So I have now met the spot for my first secondary branch, and I am going to go up. And then this is also then the first place where I meet another one of my branches, this little arm right here, and I am going to work that now. So you can, I think, hope to start to see what I mean about gaps. You're not seeing a full motif develop immediately as we did with the back stitch. So I'm going to go back and close that up. Which will give me a motif that looks identical front and back. And now I'm going to work the opposite arm. I want to make sure to pick that up here and, again, not miss anything. This is the first contact point with both of these, so I want to make sure that I get them in now. Got one stitch. Then I'm going to come back and close. This returns me to my vertical branch. So I'm going to keep going upwards until I meet my next elements, which are those 3 little stitches at the top. So when you're reversible stitching, always think about where your thread is passing front and back. It will help you because here I know that I need to see each of those front and back. So when I go down at the top, I have to return to this point to make sure that I have a full stitch front and back. I'm going to return again to that same point. And then this is how I move back down my vertical, closing off that branch. When I come up here at the bottom point, this is now fully closed front and back. What you see on the front is identical to what you would see on the back if you looked right this second. And then I'm back on my main horizontal branch. So the little individual motif branches, those are all fully closed. I know I've done it correctly. And then I am just seeing running stitch with those little gaps. And that's correct. And then I'm going to move up and start my next border motif. The passes can be different when you're working with odd numbers. You can meet the motif differently and have to work a slightly different stitch path. But as long as you're correctly thinking your way through the stitch, that should not be a problem. So here, as I return to that vertical line, closed off that arm, and then I'm going to work the one on the opposing side. Actually, no, that's just over one. I need to go over two. It is really hard to count with a camera right where you want to have your face. So I may make some counting errors here, but that's okay. This is just for demonstration purposes to walk you through double running stitch. So as I go down here, that gives me a complete arm on the front, but it's not complete on the back until I come up at my horizontal, because that closes off this stitch right here. Really essential concept with reversible stitching. Where is your thread going front and back? You always need to be thinking about that because it will make everything much more clear. It will lead to fewer errors if you can picture where your thread is front and back. You won't miss things. Although double running stitch, I think, is very logical. So as long as you keep in mind that every time you go away from the main trunk, you need to have a completely filled in motif when you return to it, as I'm about to do here, you shouldn't go too far wrong. It's kind of like a hobbit's tale, there and back again. So here I am back at my main horizontal branch. Oh, and I've really knotted my thread, so hold please. So now I am at my last little border motif. We're going to work this one more time, and then I will be back at the base and I will show you how I close up the base line to have a full border motif, and then we'll take a look at the varying back structures. Even if you're not stitching the Britomart sampler reversibly, I hope you will think about at least trying double running stitch, just because it's a very efficient way of moving through your motifs. As you can see, as I work each arm, I'm returning to this vertical line, and then as I finish my vertical line, I return to the bottom here to my horizontal. I don't have any awkward jumps or carries. I'm always exactly where I need to be, and that is the real beauty of double running stitch. It is more efficient from a literal thread usage perspective. You're using less thread than you would with backstitch. That's not really critical. I have allowed for some extra in trying to calculate quantities on the Britomart sampler. It's more just you're not going to have to deal with awkward carries or finding yourself in the wrong place, which will happen if you are using backstitch. Again, this border is very small. The carries consequently are not large, but there are larger and more complicated borders that on the Britomart sampler that are more efficiently worked in double running stitch than in backstitch. However, if you're sitting there thinking, you know what, this really isn't for me, that's fine. Work it in backstitch. I've made my plea for why I think double running stitch is really efficient, whether or not you're stitching reversibly. However, I would note that once you get into the logic and the mindset of it, it's kind of a gateway drug to reversible stitching, because you're going to see, you know, this really isn't that hard once you've made the mental leap. It's actually eminently logical. So now as I come up here, I'm through my first left to right pass on this border, and the only thing left to do is to go right to left and close up my main branch, which will give me a complete motif. So I'm just coming up and I'm filling in those gaps. I'm trying to when I can find the right hole. Almost there. And last stitch. Okay, so as we can see, those two motifs are functionally identical on the front. Where they really differ is the back. I'm going to insert a comparison photo here of the front and, of the back in backstitch and in double running stitch, which will really show you what the variance is here and why you might want to consider double running stitch, whether or not you're stitching reversibly. We are now going to look at reversible cross. There are different ways to make a normal stitch reversible, and one of the most common is to add an extra pass to make sure that you've got each element showing on front and back. A key element of reversible stitching, as I mentioned with double running stitch, is that you need to think about where your thread is passing on the back. At first, you're going to have to look, or at least I did, but soon you're going to find that you can picture it in your head. And at some point, the switch will flip mentally and it'll be much easier for you. Linda Vinson of Needle Made Designs has charted 4 ways to stitch crosses reversibly in her reversible cross stitch sampler, and I really recommend her chart as an introduction to reversible cross stitching. It has really detailed and very clear diagrams that explain the variations and the stitch paths, which are really important with letters because they have so many quick direction changes. It's actually one of the more difficult applications of reversible cross stitching. However, her chart handles this excellently. It's a wonderful introduction to the topic. I highly recommend it. Today, Today we're going to look at just one of those 4 ways to create reversible crosses, which is my personal preference for reversible cross. It adds an extra vertical stitch on the back and an extra diagonal on the front to produce this pattern on the front and this pattern on the back. I'm going to be starting with an away knot, and so I am going to just stitch right over that thread that's running on the back, which will secure it, and then I can clip my knot on the front to hide the starting of my thread. When possible, I always like to keep thread beginnings and endings on the back because I think it looks neater. So let's go through reversible cross with the variation I prefer. I am going to come down, and then I am going to return at my starting place. So that first pass gave me that same diagonal front and back, which is the critical point, and then I'm going to double that. I come down here, and then I come up directly below it. This is what gives me my vertical, sorry about the wobbling, I just knocked the frame. That gives me my vertical on the back, but what's really important about it is it allows me to position my thread correctly for the next pass on the front, which is me closing up my cross, but only on the front. You wouldn't have your closing diagonal until you come up in this position for your next cross. That closes off your cross front and back. You can see the genius behind reversible stitching. It's really not that complicated once you have the basic concept mastered, which is everything needs to appear front and back, and that there are different ways to approach that. Very frequently, just add an extra pass, and you also always need to think about where you're going, not just where you are right now, but we'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going to talk you through this a couple more times. So I go down. That gives me my first diagonal on the front. Come up at my starting point. That gives me my first diagonal on the back. Go over it again. And then come up bottom right corner, which positions me to make my closing diagonal on the front. And then when I come up to begin the next stitch, I get my closing diagonal on the back. I like this variation on reversible cross because the extra diagonal on the front just makes the cross a little fuller, and that looks more natural to me than the vertical. You can essentially do this the same way, but with front and back reversed, where you get just one diagonal in each direction on the front, interrupted by the vertical, this pattern that I have in the back in the variation I have chosen. But I find that that vertical element is visually disruptive to the pattern of the cross stitches. Sorry, I've just knotted my thread on the back there. And so I prefer the pattern that just gives you the diagonals that you expect to see with cross stitch on the front, and then you only see those vertical passes on the back. Hold on, I need to rethread my needle here. This is real life stitching, guys. It's not always perfect. Or at least it's not when it's me and I can't thread my needle because I'm on camera and apparently I've got performance anxiety. Okay, here we go. So that's why I prefer the variation that I do. However, different stitchers prefer different variations. There's absolutely Nothing wrong with that, and you should feel free to explore what's out there. They're all in either the proper stitch, which has those 3 variations, or Linda Vincent has an extra one to make for 4 in her reversible cross stitch sampler. So now I'm going to pretend like I have reached the end of my reversible cross stitching. I'm going to take my needle down. Can you see the problem if I just stopped there? There's no matching diagonal on the back. That is created when I come up for my next stitch. But what if there is no next stitch? So there are a lot of different ways to deal with that, and we'll talk about these in more detail in the Britomart sampler course. But one really easy way to do that is then just add an extra pass. So if I go back down over my second diagonal on the front, then that cross is a little fuller, but I have also managed to close up my cross front and back on this element, and then I could just run my needle under the stitches on the back to close. Now, this is for stitching reversible crosses in an unbroken straight line as seen here. To change direction, you then need to reorder your passes so that you end up in the right spot to begin the next stitch and to close off your previous stitch. The closing off of the previous stitch is something that we just explored right there. This is another critical component of the theory of reversible stitching. You always need to be thinking about where you're going and not just where you are right now. It's a little like chess. You want to be thinking several moves ahead, not just where am I, but what changes am I going to make? How do I need to alter my stitch path to get there? Double running stitch and reversible cross are 2 foundational stitches in stitching reversibly, but the world of reversible stitching is much wider as explored in the Britomart sampler. Satin stitch, Montenegrin stitch, double back stitch, long arm cross, eyelets, Algerian eyelets, and more are all stitches that can be reversible depending on how they're executed. How do you order your passes? Do you add extra ones? What variations on method and adjustments do you need to make sure that every stitch is showing front and back? It's all about thinking your way through it, thinking about where you're going, and thinking about where your thread is passing on both the front and the back to give you a complete pattern. I hope that this has helped to give you an idea of what is involved in reversible stitching and some of the theory behind it. Again, the full details of stitching reversibly generally, or on the Britomart sampler particularly, are beyond the scope of this tutorial, which is meant just as a basic introduction to help you decide if reversible stitching is for you and what's involved in it. Further resources that I recommend and which are linked in the description are The Proper Stitch by Darlene O'Steen, the Reversible Cross Stitch Sampler by Needle Made Designs, and my own Britomart Sampler course, which will go into detail about every motif and how it's stitched on the sampler. Reversible stitching can be incredibly satisfying and rewarding. I find it very engaging, although I really hated it at first. It was slow to start with, and then the mindset became quite natural to me, and I found that I really enjoyed it. I took a lot of satisfaction in seeing the pattern develop front and back. So even if you don't take to it at first, or if you haven't in the past, that is not a deficiency in you or a sign that you can't do it. It takes a minute to adapt. It's also perfectly fine not to do it at all. I recommend it primarily if you enjoy the spectacular drama of a fully finished back, which I confess that I do, or the mental exercise of reversible stitching. Whether or not you want to try reversible stitching, I hope that you're finding joy in your stitching, and I'll see you again on Tuesday for the release of the Britomart sampler. Until then, happy stitching.